Hey 4900, before we get started on our Western blots, let's take a look at loading buffers.
What is a Western blot loading buffer? I'm glad you asked. A loading buffer is a solution which is added to your isolated protein samples in order to prepare them for loading into your gels for the process of gel electrophoresis.
So what does a loading buffer do? Loading buffers are used for sample preparation as they add a negative charge to the amino acids of the protein sample. This causes the proteins to migrate to the negative end of the gel based off of size. They are also needed for loading as the increased density causes the sample to collect at the bottom of the well. Finally, loading buffers assist in tracking by the use of a dye.
A typical loading buffer has three critical components: a denaturant, a reducing agent, and a tracking dye. Today, we will be working with a Lamely buffer. This loading buffer consists of SDS, or sodium dodecyl sulfate, which helps denature the isolated proteins and proportionally coats them in a negative charge; BME, or beta-mercaptoethanol, which stabilizes the reduced thiol groups on the proteins and makes sure they cannot be reoxidized during the Western blot process; EDTA, which inactivates various proteases by ligating free metals in the sample that are needed for these enzymes to function; bromophenol blue, which acts as our tracking dye; tris buffer, which keeps the samples at a constant pH ranging from 7 to 9, and glycerol, which adds density to the sample.
Loading buffer concentrations are set up as a volumetric ratio between the protein sample and the buffer itself. The concentrations are denoted as a factor such as 2x, 4x, or 6x. If you were using a 6x loading buffer for the loading of 10 microliters total volume into your wells, for example, you would set up the ratio as 8.33 microliters of your isolated protein sample and 1.67 microliters for loading buffer. This sets the ratio at 5 to 1. This, like a dilution factor, gives you 6x when you add the numbers together.
Why use different concentrations of loading buffer? We need to make sure we denature all the proteins of interest in each sample. Choosing a loading buffer concentration is largely dependent on the concentration of the sample. In general, lower sample concentrations need more concentrated buffers. Let's do an example. You have a set of isolated protein samples where the lowest concentration of protein is 1.5 micrograms per microliter, and you want to load 10 micrograms of this isolated protein. This means we require 6.67 microliters of sample. We base the concentration of our loading buffer and the volume we use off of this lowest concentration sample volume.
If you wanted a final volume of 10 microliters per well, what concentration of loading buffer would you use? If you said 3x, you're right. We hope you now know the basics of Western blot loading buffers. Good luck in the lab!